He says, Mike, you know the country's in dire trouble when the PM is asking the regulators for growth, who aren't exactly known for being engines of the economy. While he's at it, maybe you should ask train drivers how to improve the NHS or teachers how to improve potholes. Yeah, very good point. I don't see what the point is of asking regulators, but this is the trouble with people who only understand the state sector. They only understand regulators. They only understand quangos. They only understand the public sector. They don't get growth because they don't really know how to achieve it. They think they can get it by taxing loads of people so that they spend less money in the economy voluntarily. Well, that's not how you get growth. Anyone can tell you that. Julian Jessop, I'm sure, would agree. Julian, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
So, apparently, Ofgem, Ofwat, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Competition and Markets Authority are all engines of growth, and we should be seeking their advice so that we know how to make it happen.
Well, it certainly does smack of desperation. If the newspaper reports are to be believed, the regulators were sent a letter on Christmas Eve asking them to come up with pro-growth ideas by mid-January. So they've been set a very tight deadline to do something they've not really ever had to do before. But it is the season of goodwill still, so I'm going to try and look at this as a positive thing.
OK, good luck. I should look forward to this then.
Yeah, so you obviously can't regulate your way to growth, but you can deregulate your way to growth.
Yeah.
So if you set these people a clear mandate and say, look, you have to come up with specific ideas to reduce the amount of regulation that we have in the economy, and that boosts growth, and I think that's something we should welcome. It's worth saying, too, that this is basically continuing a programme set in place by the previous government. So, Jeremy Hunt, when he was Chancellor, Kemi Badenoch, when she was Business Secretary, wrote a letter in November 2023, so strengthening the so-called growth duty on regulators. So in a sense, Labour's just continuing what the Conservatives were doing. The question, of course, is whether this government in particular has any real appetite for doing this. I mean, it's a cabinet with nobody with any real business experience in it. In almost every other field of life, they're increasing the role of the state rather than rolling it back. So I think the jury's going to be out for some time whether this will actually deliver anything meaningful. But the idea of asking regulators to come up with ideas to boost the economy by effectively doing less, I think has to be a good one.
Maybe, but I mean, don't believe there will be such a thing as a regulator who wants to do less, because that's not what they're about. They're about more regulation every single time you ask them, aren't they? And as a matter of interest, did they answer the letter that they got from the Tories? And if so, what did they say in it?
Well, there are a few regulators, I think, that deserve a bit of credit. So some of the regulators in financial services, for example, have been quite good in rolling back some of the regulations that we don't really need. So ridiculous regulations on the amount of information that retail investors need, for example. And there have been some positive changes over the last few years, admittedly driven by government. So getting rid of the bankers' bonus cap. I know that's not a particularly popular idea, but it was a regulation that no longer served any useful purpose and was damaging the competitiveness of the city. So there are a few positive examples, particularly in financial services. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole culture of being a regulator is to err on the side of caution. I mean, this is seen in spades. Anything the European Union does is basically clamping down on growth. They just like doing more and more. So it's quite a shift in culture to get regulators to agree effectively to do less. It's sort of like asking turkeys to choose the right date for Christmas or whatever else.
And so far, since they've been in, I mean, they seem to have fundamentally misunderstood the way that the economy works, because having come in what was, I would say, reasonable sort of economic health, and I know, you'll probably say, well, we weren't doing brilliantly, but I mean, as a G7 country, we were doing better than many others. In 6 months, they've managed to lose that momentum and take us into a kind of negative growth area, because they seem to be obsessed with only really getting sort of public sector investment as a vehicle for growth. Keir Starmer went over to Saudi Arabia to try and get partnerships with the Saudis to build a load of, green projects in the UK, housing, carbon capture and all of this. It's almost like trying to persuade private companies to put money into joint ventures with government. That seems to be the way they think you grow an economy.
I think, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, the irony is that a lot of the problem over the last few decades has been that the state has got too big, and yet we now have a government that thinks the solution is an even bigger state.
Right.
So the budget effectively is going to transfer another 2% or so of national income from the private sector to the public sector at a time when the tax burden is already at a record high and productivity, particularly in public services, is very low. And if we look at specific policy areas, I mean, in particular things like the labour market, so another big increase in employment rights, which are, are great for some workers, but increased rights creates increased obligations for employers who may well
Yes,
decide
and
it's not
costs.
worth. Exactly, more costs, more expensive to hire and fire workers, which means that companies will do less of that.
Yeah.
So some workers will benefit, but many others won't.
And that's before you mentioned national insurance increases as well.
Exactly, that's another good example of a effectively anti-business policy.
Yeah.
The argument seems to be that national insurance is paid by businesses and therefore doesn't affect working people. But of course it does, because it's passed on in the form of lower wages, higher prices, and in many cases job losses. So there's a perception that businesses are not part of the economy in some way, that you can regulate them, you can tax them, and it doesn't affect real people. But quite the opposite is true. Businesses are just things on paper. They're paper entities.
Yeah.
Anything you do to them will ultimately impact real people.
And an awful lot of it's about confidence. And one of the things that they did badly, I think, in the beginning of their tenure, at the first 2 or 3 months, was to talk the economy down to such an extent that while people were waiting around for the budget to come, they weren't investing. And they were going, well, we're not quite sure where they're going with this, so we're not going to put any money in. We got Elon Musk today saying in a letter to Scottish politicians, basically, that very few companies will be willing to invest in the UK because of the current administration, which he says is not really friendly to wealth creators.
Well, that's right. I mean, Labour was claiming to be the new party of business, and of course that now rings extremely hollow.
Yeah.
They definitely made a mistake. I think even Labour ministers recognise this, that they talked down the economy too much over the summer.
Yeah.
But then they capped that off with a budget that introduced much bigger increases in tax and other business costs than anybody had anticipated. And it's not just the budget, it's all the other things they're doing around interventions in the labour market, in energy policy. We haven't touched yet on Ed Miliband, and everything else that they're doing. Yeah. So, and I'd love to give them the benefit of the doubt on these regulatory changes as well, and other areas like reform of pensions and planning. But the initial signs are not encouraging. And looking at the makeup of the cabinet, it's not obvious that a lot of people are really buying into this. You haven't got any figure like Argentina's new leader, Milei, or anything close to that in the Labour government. Not at all. And in fact, quite the reverse. There is no public body, and I include what I would regard as the wokest Bank of England and even the OBR. These are not exactly, hardline conservative think tank type people. They're saying it's a disaster. There's nothing good that came out of the budget. There's nothing good that's going to come out of it in the coming year. And I mean, I suppose the question now is, Julian, is it something that they're going to have to look at reversing? Well, I think they're going to hope that something comes along to rescue them. And there are a few positives. You mentioned the Bank of England. I think the Bank of England might now be willing to cut interest rates more aggressively than it was before, focusing more on growth than any short-term impact on inflation. I think also the external environment as well. I mean, it's not just the UK that slowed sharply over the course of this year. Big problems in Germany and France and uncertainties about the US. Maybe the external environment will improve. Things could start to turn around in Germany in particular if they loosen their fiscal rules. When Trump comes in, maybe he won't be as bad as some people fear, might actually be quite good. So I think they'll try and hang on a bit longer. And I think the second half of next year will look a lot better than the first. But for now, at least, unambiguously grim. It looks like the December retail sales figures will be poor again. Pretty much nobody went shopping apparently on Boxing Day, which is unusual.
Well, they obviously didn't see the pictures from Westfield Shopping Centre, did they?
No. I mean, we went shopping ourselves, and we're pretty much the only people there.
Really?
So,
interesting.
There's certainly some signs that the hangover in terms of the impacts on consumer confidence as well as business confidence and sentiment in the market are going to continue for some time yet. And of course, the main budget measures haven't even been introduced yet. It's not until April that national insurance actually goes up and the national minimum wage rises. So, the first half of the year, I think, is bound to be weak because of all the uncertainties. But I'm a bit more optimistic that things will start to turn around in the second. For a start, most families will still see their incomes rise faster than prices. We will get, I think, bigger interest rate cuts. The increase in public spending is not going to be brilliant, but it will offset some of the weakness in the private sector. So I'm not all doom and gloom for next year, but the economy is certainly weaker than it needs to be as a result of government policies. Indeed. Julian, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed.